Hi everyone, I'm Faisal, like you heard. So how many of you have actually used Flutter here? Good, good, good. So I gave a talk a long time ago and it was on CoffeeScript, I think, or it was something. I don't know, actually it was an advanced Android talk, and I got up there and I said, alright, so how many people have done Android here? And not a single person raised their hand up. And I was like, crap, this talk's going to be terrible. It turned out they're all iOS engineers thinking they can just port their iOS skills to Android. So foolish. So this talks about Flutter, and Flutter, which we'll get into, started off as a really internal Google project, and I'll talk about that story. So I've been a Google developer expert for a while now. I've been talking about Dart and Android TL and other conferences. And during the day, I'm a senior engineer at Zoom.ai. We're a cool AI company that does a lot of cool stuff. So Zoom.ai does not use Flutter. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Flutter and where it came from first. So Flutter really started internally at Google when they faced a problem that they kept having to write their apps twice. Right? How many people here have Android and iOS apps? Actually maintaining. Right. And so you push out an app on cool feature on Android, then you're like, oh, gotta do it for iOS, right? Or vice versa. Personally, I built an Android app and I've procrastinated building an iOS app for 2 years now, even though that Android app is profitable. And now I'm finally gonna build an iOS app using Flutter. And so internally, Google was facing the same issues. They kept having to rewrite their apps and it was hurting their productivity, and they just kept having to negotiate with developers on feature sets, right? Because there's a lot of bugs. Each system has its own set of bugs, set of weirdness with large code bases, we all know. Lots of cool random stuff happens. And so Google started to think about cross-platform technology. Previously in the past, they built on the web GWT. Anyone use that? Yes, right? It was pretty neat, pretty cool, but that wasn't really scalable to mobile. Right? They didn't want an HTML5, Cordova, or PhoneGap type solution, which were crazy. Anyone used those technologies before? Cordova or PhoneGap? Good. Well, the rest of them, you guys are lucky. Those technologies were terrible. Having to go through Angular and CSS and figuring out how to render the DOM faster, so garbage. So anyways, Google started looking into this, and they started investigating the entire technology stack Google has. And they went through Go, Python. They tried to find a language that fits the mobile ecosystem, right? Java was already there. Kotlin wasn't around yet. And internally, they found that a lot of the teams at Google were using a language called Dart. And Dart was really designed for the modern web. It had really bad PR early on the start. And I don't know if it's Google's fault or just crazy bloggers, but they said that Dart is here to kill JavaScript. That was never really the intention of Dart. Dart was supposed to be the super set, not on top of JavaScript, but learning from all the lessons of JavaScript and build a new, nice programming language, right? With its own VM that runs on the server if you want to build Node.js style backend applications, or compile to JavaScript if you're doing front-end applications. So the Dart VM actually is built by the people who did V8 engine. So it was a lot of cool talent behind Dart. So anyways, this team at Google, that was actually the Chrome team, found Dart, and they started repurposing the language to see how they can make it work on mobile, and repurposing the VM specifically. And they realized that the VM could easily work on mobile, but now they needed to find a rendering engine. And they started looking for what's a nice rendering engine that Google has. And turns out they have this little tiny piece of software called Chrome that is this crazy fast rendering engine. And if you take away the DOM and if you take away the CSS nonsense there, you have a really nice rendering engine that really renders pixels, animations, videos pretty fast, right? Chrome is possibly the best browser. Safari comes close. And so they took WebKit, and I think it was called Blink at that time. They removed all the CSS, JavaScript, anything related to HTML, and they just left the rendering engine, and they put Dart on top. And they called it Sky. And at Berlin, or Munich, 3 years ago, they announced it, saying, this is Sky. And they talked about how their vision of the future for mobile is writing applications once, having them run on all mobile platforms, iOS and Android, natively. Not some sort of weird hybrid HTML, CSS application, or even when you get to React Native, and we'll talk about the differences, but it's native in the sense React Native is native, but it's also running a V8 engine there that's taking the JavaScript, interpreting it, and then rendering the native Android or iOS component. What they wanted to do, Flutter, was take the Dart language, and then when you actually render the component, it's rendered inside of their rendering engine. So it's pixel perfect in all different languages, all different platforms. So that's where Flutter came from. And to recap, it's not a web view. And initially there was a lot of skepticism around, well, if it's the Chrome team and they took the web Blink, the rendering engine, it's probably a web view. It's not a web view. They just took the rendering engine because it's really nice. And it's meant to be fast, beautiful, and natural. And what that really means is fast means that it's supposed to render at 60 frames per second natively on Android and iOS. This means that despite whatever phone that you're using it on, all the crazy Samsung phones, it will still run fine. And beautiful means that they really adopted the material design spec. How many here use material design in their applications? Almost everyone, right? And the misconception of material design is it doesn't mean that you have to all your apps look like Google. There's a lot of good examples of material design that your application doesn't look like a Google application, like Evernote or Pocket or any of these top apps. If you look at it, they're all material design, but they're very custom to that. The branding is very custom. Anyways, so they took the beautiful aspect of material design. They sit, at least they used to, right beside the material design team. So everything is to spec. All the components are there that you would expect material design to have. And natural is the key part of this Flutter story. Natural means that back in the day, if you were doing Cordova, PhoneGap, or any other sort of cross-platform framework, if you built an application on Android or iOS, it would behave like an Android application on iOS also, or iOS application on Android also. So for example, iOS users are used to the flexible elastic scrolling on iOS. If you built a cross-platform application, Android users would see that, and it would throw them off. That's not how Android works, or vice versa. They would see hollow or material design, not material design, they would see hollow or other sorts of design paradigms that are akin to Android. For example, pressing the back button doesn't exist on iOS, but the animation acted like you pressed the back button. And so, lots of stuff like that. What Flutter did was, when you write your application once, it automatically adapts to which platform it's running on. So if it's running on iOS, all the controls will behave like iOS controls. They'll be flexible, they'll behave with physics, the correct physics. And on Android, they'll behave like an Android app. It'll have that weird blue glow at the end of the list view, and when you press back, the animation will be correct. And on iOS, you can swipe controllers, so you'll be able to do that. And that's the story behind fast, beautiful, and natural. And that's what the goal is. And right now, almost everything behaves that way, with the exception of probably one or two bugs that they have, and they're always fixing these bugs. So let me show you a hello world. And this is a crazy hello world because we're going to go right from creating a new project. I have a backup in case it doesn't work, as with demos, but we'll try it. So the way you develop a Flutter application, you would originally just go to flutter.io. We'll get there later. But you would go to flutter.io and you would download the installer, install it, and you have the choice of installing a plugin either on Android Studio, VS Code, and all the derivations of that, or IntelliJ. So my idea of choice is IntelliJ, but you can do this on Android Studio. I even have an Android Studio plugin I can show later. So what you would do, you would click Create New Project. You would go choose Flutter, choose the application name. So I'm going to say Android Meetup, new Flutter app, and then package. This is familiar to Android developers specifically. If you can see that, the top is the project name, and then you got a description just explaining what your app is. And then you have organization, which is the package name for Android or the bundle ID for iOS. You can always go ahead and open the specific projects later, and I'll show you the tour of the project structure in a second. And then you can choose if you want your Android project to be a Java project or a Kotlin project, and iOS to be Objective-C or Swift. So that's really your choice. I'm going to choose Kotlin and Swift. I'm going to hit Finish. and it's going to go ahead and create this project. It'll take a second, and what it's doing right now is two things. It's creating the entire Android project. It's creating the Gradle files, downloading all the stuff required for that, and it's creating an Xcode workspace file, Xcode project, getting all that stuff right. So now that I say download, I actually think it won't download because I need internet.
Do you want a hotspot?
Yeah, well, I can just do it on my end.
Are you sure?
Yeah, that's fine. One second, guys. Alright, I'm just going to kill the ID and then run it again. This is why I had it backward. Alright, so Flutter Hello is a project I previously created when I was on the network. And alright, so here's a simple Flutter app, right? And let's first just talk about the project structure so everyone is crystal clear on that. When I expand the project here, and so you have the generic ID folder. You don't need to worry about that. Then you have an Android folder. For all the Android developers here, you can go in, and it's your typical Android folder. You got your resources, you got your Java code, you got your plugins, and we'll talk about that in a second. Then you have your Gradle. You have a build Gradle file, and if you take a look at exactly what's happening in the build Gradle file, you'll see that it's Flutter generated some code here that's injecting the Flutter SDK and doing all sorts of stuff there. At the core essence, what Flutter is in your Android project is just a view. So what you technically can do is if you don't want to rewrite your entire application to Flutter, you can just import this Flutter view into your application and start building it that way. Right? So it's a nice little transition over if you want, or you can just go, you know what, file new project, I'm going to start a Flutter app. And the same goes for our Xcode here, I won't demo that. And so the lib folder is where the source code lies. And what I'm going to do right now is just run the application. And if my Pixel was plugged in, I could run it on my Pixel. Right now I'm just going to run the iOS simulator because it's always faster. Otherwise we'll be here for a while. Though I think with recent times Android has fixed their emulator problem. But it's still not comparable to the simulator that iOS has. Let's just give it a second. It's going to boot up. And I'm going to run this right now. And what it's doing is, if you look at the console, because it's running on iOS, it's running Xcode build. If I were to run this on a Pixel, it would run Gradle build and compile. So it's running Xcode clean, starting Xcode build. And it'll take a second. And this is the only time you're actually going to have to wait when you're doing Flutter development, when it builds for the first time. So as Android developers, we know that Gradle takes a while to build, especially for large projects. And now I'm going to show you some cool Flutter magic here. All right, so a typical Android development cycle, your designer is standing right next to you, and he or she is like, all right, well, you know what? I don't like this blue color. You wasted my time. I have to wait until Gradle builds, and now it's blue. Make it red. You would go to your colors XML file, change it to red, and then run it again, and then wait for Gradle to build again. What you could do in Flutter has this concept of hot reload. So I can find where this blue is, and that is the theme of the app. And I'm just going to change it to red. Hit save, and in an instant, the application changes to red, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg here. So I'm going to change a string here. I'm going to call it. Call this widget.title. I'm going to name it text. right? You can see I changed the component there at the top, hello world. And now I'm going to do something even cooler. I'm going to hit this button, and it's going to change this variable, right? It's counting it. What's nice is as I design and modify my application, let's change this to green, the state stays the same, right? Variable 23 stays the same. So it's remembering the state. And so if I'm 3 levels deep into an application, I've done login, I've done register, and I'm debugging this really core, flux state thing where if I kill the app, I have to go all the way to the start and retry it all. You don't have to do that anymore. And this doesn't apply to UI. I can actually change the core algorithms here. So when I click a button, it says counter plus plus. I'm going to change it to counter times 2. I'm going to save it, and it's performed a hot reload. I'm going to hit this plus button. Oh, counter equals counter. Right? I'm going to hit this, and you can see that the fundamental algorithm of the button has changed. Right? And so if you're doing API development and you forget to push in a header or the auth token, you don't have to restart your application. You can just inject the auth token now, and then just press save and run it again. Call the API again. Now, here's what's nice also. I'm going to make a mistake here. Oh, it's not a mistake actually. Actually, it's hard to make a mistake. I'm trying to send the wrong widget in. Let's see, what can I do here? Null should work. Yes, okay. So as I'm doing development, I make an error. We will all make mistakes here. And my application crashes. What's nice about Flutter is because it remembers the state, I can just delete this mistake here, hit save, and it remembers the state of the variable, remembers exactly where I was in the development cycle. Right? So I don't have to actually go ahead and reload the app or rerun it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some more components here. And it's super easy to develop here. I'm going to change this text to, this is a new component. Save that. Add a new button here. Okay, and then I'm going to add some text. This is some text. Save it. And you can see how fast the development is, right? This is, you can't go this fast on iOS. This is web level fast, where you're constantly, you have like that cool JavaScript plugin that constantly refreshes your page, and you're typing some CSS and it's making changes. This is exactly what that experience is. And this is all native. This isn't some streaming weird HTML thing. This is all native. So if I were to save this and compile it, it will run natively on an iOS device or an Android device. Any questions about this? If you have any questions, feel free to just ask. Okay, so that's just the hot reload part. With Flutter, you get the usual debugging, so I'm not even going to get into that. You can just set up, it's just standard. It's what you'd expect. What I'm going to get into here, though, is layouts. So I'm going to delete this just so it's easier to read. Coming from the Android world, we're used to doing layouts on an XML level, and we visually see what's happening there. When I first came to Flutter, that was kind of jarring. To be honest, I was like, whoa, where's my layout.xml file? How am I going to design stuff? And I saw that it was all code-based. And at first I was like, you know what, I'm skeptical. I don't think I can design complicated UIs in this. I don't think this will actually work for me. But I was pretty wrong. The reason is, when you're actually writing layout file on Android, what you do first is you design your layout, then you jump over to the Java XML file, you do find v by ID, or now you can do the data binding, set that up, and then jump back and forth, hit run, you go through the whole development cycle. Because of hot reload, when you're actually prototyping your UI, you're actually writing it live also. So instead of actually writing XML, you're just writing the Flutter code, and you're seeing your layout visually live in real time. So it's just like looking at the design view, and you can see everything happen magically in front of you. And so, for example, I'm going to go to the Flutter documentation here and grab a layout widget catalog. layout. And as you expect with any modern language platform, you have all the layouts here. You got a container, you have padding, you have center, align, fitted box, all that stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a column. Oh, it's right there. I'm going to grab a, sure, let me just delete all this. Let's go all the way to the top. All right. So here we have a scaffold, and that's just the basic framework of the app, the material app. So you have a nice toolbar. And in the body, I'm going to add a row here. So I can go to the documentation, I can look at a row or a column. I'm going to add a row so that horizontally aligns the children. And let me go back to my nice view here. And all widgets, if they're layouts, they take a child component or a children component. It takes a child if it's just a container that just takes one widget, or if it's like a list view or a layout like a row, it takes multiple children. So I'm going to take children, and you can look at the hinting. It takes an array of widgets, and so my array of widgets, I'm going to put in 3 text views. Below. Save it. And you can see at the top, I need to add padding, but you can see at the very little top here, it's adding stuff horizontally. So this is a very nice way. You won't really miss the Android layout view, only because you're basically seeing it happen in real time here. And as you develop it, you can add your actions and methods here. Any questions about that? Anyone skeptical that they're not going to miss their Android layout flow? Good.
How do you bind the values of this widget?
Yes. So now, Flutter is built on, it's very similar to React Native. Anyone's done React Native, it's a very reactive language. And so let's do some binding here. I'm going to call this a variable. New text, I'm going to call it my variable. And I'm going to create a string here at the top. My variable. I'm going to save it, it changed to string. Now, I'm going to add a button, and when I click on that button, I'm going to get that string to change. So I'm going to add a raise button. A raise button is just a button, but with nice material design animations to it. And it has an on-pressed value. So I'm going to add a listener there, but I'm going to also add a child. And a raise button takes a child of a text. So I'm going to add a text view here, new text, click. Okay. So on press, your first thought, and this is what I did, would be, okay, this makes sense. My variable equals new I got clicked, for example. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to hit click me. And you'll notice that string isn't changing, right? Even though I've assigned this value to a new variable. That's because the way the Flutter rendering engine works, it's built on this concept of states, which is a whole long, complicated, slightly topic, which we won't get into, but at the basic premise, you have to let Flutter know which one of your variables has changed, right? So it's not constantly, unlike the older versions of Angular, where it's constantly pinging all your variables to see if something's changed because your data bound to it, it's not always pinging. It's just waiting till you say, hey, something has changed. And the way you tell it something has changed is you say, hey, here's a new state, set state. And inside of my set state, I'm going to say set state clicked. Right? And when I go here, I'm going to hit click me. Oh. Did I not do it? I think I have to restart it once. I messed up there. But you would set your state wherever you want, right? And Flutter would go through the DOM tree, internal DOM, I wouldn't call it DOM, but whatever Flutter rendering tree that it has, and go, okay, Faisal marked this as dirty, I have to go update this variable. So unless I'm doing something wrong here, which I am clearly, what am I doing wrong? I think I'm just making a silly mistake here. So we won't get too much into that to waste time, but that's essentially what you would do. You would set state. So I have a sample application I can show you for set state. And so it's not actually bound to any variable, you're constantly updating it. Now one of the nice things also is coming from Android, one of the really nice things I like is the way lists operate. Again, because of the way Flutter's rendering engine works, you don't have to create adapters or write all sorts of recyclers around your list view. You just have to say, here's a list along with all my widgets, and Flutter will take care of the recycling and memory management for you there. So you can have a long-running list with an actual array that's like 500 elements, loading all these images, and not have to worry about recycling. And we can do a quick sample here. I wrote a tutorial for Flutter.io called Flutter for Android Developers. You go here, and here I'm going to find list view. What is the alternative to a list view in Flutter? The equivalent to a list view in Flutter is a list view. And so I'm just going to copy and paste this entire application here, just to show you. I'll stop this. Because I changed the entire application, I do have to rerun it. It's not that smart. All right, it's going to rebuild the application here. All right, cool. So this entire row scrolling on Android, even iOS, you would have a recycler view or a list view with an adapter, setting up the recycling, getting rid of that layout inflator trick, all sorts of crazy stuff. On on Flutter, this is all you do. You get I generate a list of widgets here. So I'm just looping for I equals 0 to 100, add on the widgets list a text that says row and then the row number. And then I create a list view and I add the children as gets list data. That's it, right? And it's created, this list can have images, it can have videos if you're going crazy, and you would still pass it in the same way. And when it comes time to update your list, you can modify children, because this is a fixed array right now, you can modify the list view to take in a builder function where you just pass in updates to the list. Just like notify data set changed, you would do something similar here. And I can show you the exact code right here. So with regards to set state, that didn't work previously. On top, you would call set state, and I'm updating the list of widgets here, and I'm creating a whole new list of widgets, and I'm telling Flutter, hey, this entire list is different, update your list view. So we can just copy and paste this code also. I'm actually curious why set state didn't work previously for me. So I'll run this again. Stop, run. And what I'm doing in this code, I believe, is I am just appending to this list a new row. It's not a good demo day. And so what I'm doing here actually is I'm disabling Dart 2.0. And so with Flutter 2 beta, what Google decided was to bring out all the good enhancements in Flutter, like inspecting the tree and debugging. You have to use really deep debugging of the view hierarchy. You have to use Dart 2.0. But the code samples aren't updated for 2.0 yet, so I just said use Dart 1.9. So it's going to work now. All right. Now I'm going to scroll down, and when I tap on a list, it's going to add a new row. So I'm going to go all the way down to this list. I'm going to tap on it, and it added a new row, right? Anyone can say it's just adding new rows. You guys got to believe me. And so tap, new row added. And what it's doing is just saying, hey, there's been an update to the widgets list, add the update to the list. And that's all it's doing there. And if I scroll down here, there's one more good question for large amounts of data, because in that sample, all it's really doing is creating a copy of that list, adding a new widget to the list, and sending that list. That's not really optimal in a real-world scenario. So you would use a builder function, like I mentioned previously, where this will be very familiar to anyone from Android. It's kind of like the adapter method, where it calls get item builder and it passes in the position of which item the Flutter list view is looking at, and then you just call get row on that. So you're still not doing any recycling, but you're just calling this method get row. So when it gets to like row 100, you can paginate and call a network and load stuff there. The other really nice thing is asynchronous development. So let's see, do I have a nice async? Yes. Okay. We're used to on Android doing a lot of async threads or creating loaders. And the nice thing about the Dart language, this isn't even really a Flutter feature. The nice thing about the Dart language is that asynchronous is built from very deeply into the language, and it's built really in a synchronous way. So it uses this concept of async await. Anyone used this in JavaScript yet, or TypeScript? A couple, right? So if you're used to the JavaScript, or even, I guess, Java's methodology of passing in callbacks, at least in Android, you create an async task, wait for a bunch of methods to run, and then you would say, okay, I have all my data, run on UI thread. In JavaScript, you would get a callback, and that's how you make sure that it's not blocking the event loop. Same thing with Node. In Flutter, what you would do is, you would, on your network call or any long-running operation, you would just await on that operation. There's no callback, and on Flutter, there's no UI thread here. So you would say, okay, here's my URL. I'm going to await for this operation. When this operation is done, I want you to update the list of widgets with all the JSON that's come back, right? And so this makes for a really nice, clean development. You don't have this callback of doom happening. It just keeps it very straightforward and less bug prone. How many of you have gotten caught in like a callback of doom where you're 3 levels deep and you make a change and you're getting stuck, right? And I'm sure so many people have here, especially with large, really large applications. So here's another example of async await. When the application loads, like on resume, there's init state, so I call load data. On the Flutter's version of on resume, load data goes here. It makes a network call, and Flutter is smart enough to know not to block the UI. And so it says, okay, well, this is not going to affect the UI, so in the UI, I'm going to show a progress bar or whatever that I want to show as a loader, while Flutter goes ahead and does the networking operation. The operation comes back, and I say, great, I have all my data, set state. And then Flutter says, all right, cool, I'm going to mark the widgets list as dirty and update this entire list. So that's how asynchronous operations work on Dart Flutter. Any questions about that? Cool. I think it's pretty clear the way async await works. So because we've kind of skipped the slides, I'm just going to go to this key slide here. It's very important to understand. What Flutter is from a high-level framework point of view, you have your material design widgets at the top. You also have, if you want your application to look really, really like an iOS app with very iOS buttons, then you can use the Cupertino widgets. Now, not every widget has a Cupertino alternative to it, so you have to be mindful of that, but most widgets do. Then you have the general widget layer. Let's say you don't like material design, you don't like how iOS is, you want to make a crazy hot pink UI, right? That's just like starbursts everywhere. Then you can just override widgets. And then below that is the rendering pipeline. You get the animation, painting, gestures. So the way on taps, on clicks, you can add an on tap, on click to really any widget. Everything is just a widget in Flutter. And so I can say, you know what? I want to add an on tap to this weird scroll bar here. Okay, I just wrap it in a gesture widget. Right? It's very composable that way. It's like a bunch of Lego blocks. And then you have your services. And so services are important because, say, Flutter doesn't have the answer to everything. If you were to say, okay, well, how do I access GPS in Flutter? Flutter doesn't provide a GPS layer. Flutter doesn't provide an SMS layer, a fingerprint layer. All that stuff, it says the operating system should do that, right? And so there's this notion of plugins. And the community has built a lot of plugins. The Flutter team itself has built a lot of plugins. And so the Flutter language is all about, the Flutter framework is all about the UI design, as well as the business logic. For anything that's related to connecting with the phone, you just use a service. Now, say you're developing, say you have like a C library or even a Java library and that you want to connect to, and Flutter doesn't provide a plugin, you can just write your own plugin. It's as simple as just sending off a message broadcast, and that's where the Java Kotlin choice comes from in the start. You can go and start modifying your Kotlin code and say, okay, when I receive a message broadcast from the Flutter world, since it's just a view sending a broadcast, do X, Y, Z, and then return an asynchronous response back to Flutter. So I can show you an example of that. This is Flutter's version of NPM. So I'm just going to search up GPS, geolocation. So this is a Flutter plugin for geolocation, officially by Flutter, I believe. This is one, okay. No, by someone named Looping. That's cool. If you're using the plugin, for all you care about, you don't have to deal with Google Play services, any of that. All you care about is where you call the GPS, which is where here in the sample code. Somewhere. Oh, right here, of course. So he calls geolocation.logging enabled, and then I guess somewhere in this code, he's actually listening to the GPS location that comes back. So you don't have to worry about the iOS code, you don't have to worry about the Android code, you're just writing Flutter. And then if you want to write your own plugin, there's a really nice documentation on Flutter here. Plugin. And then you can read about how to write your own plugin. It's very straightforward. You're just creating Java file, Objective-C file, and just listening to methods there. Any question about that? Cool. So next. All right, so I'm going to show you some demos of some nice Flutter applications. This is a cryptocurrency application, so I installed it on my Android phone. If you have Android here, you can actually go to the Play Store right now and install this application called Crypto Shadow. And if you have an iOS device, I don't know, I think it should be for iOS. I don't know if this developer actually used it. Oh. My new laptop, I don't have Visor. And the reason why I chose Crypto Shadow, not that's because it's cryptocurrency, it's because he didn't really use a very material design UI, as you can see here. It's a very custom UI that he took the material design widgets, really took out the drop shadows, modified the colors, and said, great, this is going to be my UI pattern. And you'll have to see it on your phone. It's super silky smooth. Is anyone running into any jank on this app? Anyone who's tried it? Right? And if I were to tell you that this wasn't a Flutter app, you would just think some dude made a random native Android app. Because at the end of the day, it is native. It's just not using the native Android component set. It's using Flutter's own component set that they're drawing, but it is native. It's not interpreted or a JavaScript runtime running. And also, if you click on it, you'll see the nice animations. I don't know if they show up clearly. Yeah. Right? And so, again, like what you're used to on Android, you have a shared element transition paradigm. You can do that here. I mean, it's a really ugly graph, but you have a charting library also. I don't know why this person chose this as a graph here. And so that's one application. And then the other one is a simple, more standard-looking application, but it's also very nice. It's called Inkio. And both these applications are open source. So you can always go to GitHub and actually understand what this application is. And so I'm going to run it on iPhone here. and I need to switch back to Dart 2.0 for this application. All right, thank you. And again, this just looks like a standard application. You wouldn't know that this was built in Flutter. It's just a regular iOS application. You'll see that Flutter has its own version of Picasso. It's just a simple image library. It's not as heavy as Picasso. You're not injecting a lot of code there. It's just one line, flutter.load, and you're being my simulator is running really slow. It's not supposed to write like that. And then I'm gonna click on it. It loads fine. Flutter also supports Flutter, not Flutter itself, but Flutter supports the idea of web views. So you can just launch an external web view. Here, this developer launches the trailer, youtube.com. And so you have everything you need to build an application. There's some. If you're building an application for like the emerging markets and your application is expected to run on something like Android Go, that might be an issue because Android Go, the memory is already small, like 256 megs. Plus, Flutter only supports up to Jelly Bean. So if you need an application to run on really older versions of phones like Gingerbread or something, Flutter is really not the right choice, but for anything modern, a modern device, not in emerging markets, Flutter is a good choice for there. You'll run into some issues with accessibility, and that's really because Flutter's in beta right now, and accessibility story is not fully fleshed out yet. You won't be able to, I don't think, and I could be wrong, it doesn't support like screen readers and that style of accessibility. But localization, that whole story is already there, so you won't really run into any pitfalls there. Any questions? Yes.
What's the time frame for coming out of beta?
I don't know. Is Gmail still in beta?
Yeah, Google's been very explicit that this beta is ready for public use.
Yes.
They essentially treat the beta launch as the official launch.
Yes. And so I believe that it might go 1.0 maybe at the end of the year, but I don't know any more than you do. But that's just my thinking, only because when I'm developing Flutter, it's really stable. I don't run into any issue. Like, we've played around with beta technologies where, I remember when I did Realm, and when that was beta, every time a new version came out, I'm like, oh man, I got to update all my models again, right? But with Flutter, it's not really the case anymore. During the alpha release, it was. Every time a new release came out, you had to update some piece of code. But the beta, the APIs are very stable. What's really nice is Flutter has this idea of Flutter Doctor. They stole it from Brew, I think. But if you call Flutter Doctor, what it will do is it will tell you if you're running the latest version of Flutter. It will say, great, your Android toolchain is set up, your iOS toolchain is set up, your IntelliJ, VS Code. So if you really don't have any of these tools set up, you just need to install Flutter, run Flutter Doctor, and it will go ahead and install everything for you. So it's a very nice, cohesive setup. Let me see, any other specific Flutter-related things I want to say? Yep. We showed off the Inkio app. We talked about Flutter for Android developers. So really, this is all just Q&A. Yes?
How often do you need to delve into Android or iOS specific issues when you're developing Flutter?
Unless you've built plugins specifically to talk to the phones, very rarely. I don't think I've ever actually had to do that. There was one bug during the alpha release. That's the only time I came across a bug where something worked really well on iOS. It was a horizontal gallery. And then on Android, after like the third swipe, it would kind of crash. And that was just a memory issue that they had. And it wasn't really Android specific. It was just somehow when they were compiling the code, some error was happening. But apart from that, to be honest, I've never had to actually deal with issues that are Android or iOS specific. So I know I talked to someone yesterday, and they built a lot with React Native, and they were saying, they built this React Native app in iOS, and they said, great, I'm going to test it on Android after it's done. You plug it in and everything looks different, right? Because it's actually rendering native Android controls versus the standard UI that you're writing in Flutter. Yes?
Now, if your app needed something specific, like say a broadcast receiver,
Yeah.
would you have to write that natively, or could you handle that in Flutter?
You would have to write that natively, right? And so what we didn't dive into is the idea of intents, very low-level stuff with Flutter, intents, services, broadcast receivers. So with services and stuff, you would have to write that natively. With the idea of intents, there's no such thing as an intent in Flutter. They didn't really want to copy an Android concept and tell iOS developers to adopt that. So the idea is they took a general concept that we all know, which is routing from the web. And so you have this idea of a router, and you define your router, and you say, let me actually show you in one of the source codes I have for an application. You have this idea of a router, and all you tell the router is when the user goes to a certain page, for example here, router.define /signup. /signup is really just the signup page. And so in my application, I go navigator.goto/signup. I pass in the parameters like a bundle, and this function gets triggered, and signup handler, what it does, it creates a new signup page, right? So that's how routing works. And it's pretty flexible. When it comes to that, you can pass in all sorts of arguments, and it's nice. It's just like intents, really, just a different concept.
Does that support deep links as well?
Yes. And so Flutter, all the Firebase suite is supported, including the Firebase deep linking stuff, so it's fine. Yes?
So Flutter versus React Native, what's in Flutter that's not React Native?
The big difference is this. React Native is running its own little V8 or whatever on its system. JavaScript coming in, being spit out as Android or iOS components, right? So what you're seeing there is the operating system doing all the heavy lifting for you and drawing the components, whereas Flutter said we don't want that inconsistency across devices. You know, Samsung, Asus, they might render a bunch differently, and we know how, as Android, even native Android developers run into that issue. I know at Kobo I used to run into that issue all the time, right? And so with Flutter, it's uniform, it's the same, right? You can, by all means, say, if on iOS, change this button to look like a circle, but that's up to you. But it will remain consistently drawn.
Can you see the stack trace when your app crashes?
Pardon?
Can you see the stack trace
Yes.
when your app crashes?
Yes, so when you saw that big red screen and all the stuff happening, that was the stack trace. And then there's a handler that you can actually receive all your stack traces and pass it to Crashlytics or Loggly or whatever service you're using.
And also, how do you structure the application? Can you use MVP, MVM? Because it looks so like everything is in the same place. Like, can you
Yes, you can,
somehow?
for demo purposes, that's what I show, but yes, you can structure it any way you like, right? You need that build function there. That build function you can move around, but you can by all means create a, because the widgets are immutable and they're easily flexible, you can move around any file. You can just create a new file that's just for your view code and have that build function call that file. It probably makes it easy for testing too. Yes?
How does it actually work? Because you're writing in Dart,
Yep.
and then it renders to a view that you add to your application.
Yep.
So
It's
and
compiling.
stack trace, so
It's compiling it, and the stack trace isn't a Java stack trace or Objective-C stack trace. It's a Flutter Dart stack trace.
so it
Flutter
compiles it
Dart
to what?
stack trace. Pardon?
It compiles it to what?
Native whatever code,
So it compiles
ARM,
it to Kotlin code or C or like assembly language.
assembly language, so like Dalvik bytecode or whatever Flutter's using, Art, whatever Android's using, Art.
Oh, so it compiles it to JVM.
Yes.
Oh, okay, and then on iOS it compiles it to.
So actually, hold on. I think I got confused there. What are you asking about? Are you asking about the entire application or actual the Dart code itself?
What happens to this Dart code?
This Dart code is actually compiled to whatever the Flutter framework is meant to read, right? So I think internally it compiles to some level of, they have, I think it's called FLX, some bytecode that the virtual machine running reads.
So there's a Dart virtual machine?
It's not a Dart virtual, it's a rendering engine that's reading it.
Oh, a rendering engine, okay. And the rendering engine is written in like C++ or something?
Yeah, whatever it's reading.
Can you see the compiled code? Like when you write in Kotlin, you can see the Java version, like Java bytecode
Yeah.
version.
No, you can't see that here. I don't think you can. I don't think you have access to it because it's not transpiling it. It's not going from Kotlin to Java. It's actually just going from Flutter to whatever compiled stuff natively it needs to do to get it to render on that Flutter view. I don't know too much about that, but there's 2 good videos that will answer that. If you go to Flutter.io, actually I could read up on that. I'm curious too now. But if you go to Flutter.io docs, all the way at the bottom it says Flutter's layer design and Flutter's rendering pipeline. Those 2 videos have the answer to that. So I may be wrong, but you can go there and that'll be the answer. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you see Flutter as like a replacement to traditional like native iOS and Android development, or if it's more of a complement.
I think it depends on the person. Depends on the company. I would personally use it as a replacement. I don't know. I haven't done any Android development in over a year now because of Flutter, unless I'm writing any plugins specifically. I don't know what Google's vision is. There's no way I can know that. But we've all heard about Fuchsia, which is this next level operating system for mobile. That's all written in Flutter. So if you go there, if you look at the source code, what's funny is you can actually, because Flutter is portable, you can actually go to Fuchsia's open source repo, grab all the UI code, and run it on your Android. There's nothing stopping you from not doing that because it's just Flutter code. It's very portable, right? It's cross-platform. And so I don't actually know if it's going to be a replacement or not. Big companies, I don't think will ever replace it. But I've talked to a couple of big companies in the past couple of weeks, and what they're doing is they're introducing Flutter to their application screen by screen, right? And so they're using Flutter, they're using the Dart code as this common API library that they can share on iOS and Android and have a Flutter view there with some code execution. You know, maybe it's like a profile page, or maybe it's a map view or something that this common library can read. And then what's neat about that common library is because it has no UI specific code, you can actually use it on the web too, right? So this company that I spoke to yesterday, what their grand vision in 2 years, it's a pretty big Toronto company too, their grand vision in 2 or 3 years is to use Dart as a library that's backing their web app, their mobile, and their mobile apps, right? So the developers are only writing 2 UIs, a front end on the web and a front end on mobile. And then the common library stays the same across. Yes?
So when you're writing plugins and services, those are things you have to write twice if you want
Yes.
to have Android and iOS.
Yeah. And so what you'll find is, that's actually, I guess if there was a con that I can find, I mean, there might be some cons, but a good con that I can find is that, especially when you're on Pub and you're trying to find a library, what you'll usually find is, if the developer knows iOS, he'll write a plugin and he'll say, the Android version is missing, help me out. Right, so that's what happened with the in-app purchase library. And so this developer wrote it for iOS, and then I just took an Android library and I created the Android version of the in-app purchase plugin. So it's one plugin with 2 code bases now. Yeah.
So how does Flutter handle screen rotation?
Just like you would normally, it renders it fine. It doesn't kill everything and rebuild it. It just builds it normally. It's not the idea of killing all the widgets, losing all the state, and then recovering that state. That's not happening there.
What do you think about the Dart language? Would you wish it was Kotlin?
No, Dart. See, no, I actually don't wish it's Kotlin. I'll tell you why. At least my personal reason. Everyone here, if you guys didn't understand that Dart code, be honest and raise your hand, right? So, one person, but that Dart code is very, very, very close to any other language you've seen, right? Maybe there's 1 or 2, something like an async modifier that you just have to read up on, but the Dart language is very boring, right? There's not a lot of fancy stuff happening. There's very little ways to shoot yourself in the foot, right? So it's a very nice language to get up running easily. If you're just an experienced programmer, even if you're a junior programmer, if you know Python, if you know JavaScript, you'll easily be able to understand Dart. So with that, I think Dart's a great language. Kotlin, in my opinion, isn't easy language for everyone to pick up with right away. There's a lot of sugar syntax. And I love sugar syntax, and Dart has a lot of sugar syntax, but it doesn't require you to use it. right? So that's why I think Dart's pretty scalable as a language. There's a lot of good UX there. And as developers, we don't really think about the UX of a language. Sometimes we get carried away with like one-line code that looks crazy, or when you look at Ruby or PHP, I mean, what kind of language starts with a question mark, right? So when I look at all these languages, they don't have good UX sometimes. But Dart has really nice UX.
Dart is dynamically typed.
Yes, but as of Dart 2, it's still dynamically typed, but there's a lot of type inference going on there. And so you can't, unlike JavaScript where you can say var x equals 1 and then later say x equals 8, you can't do that in Dart. You can still say var x equals 1, but later in Dart, if you say x equals 8, it will actually give you a runtime error.
What's the runtime for Dart? Like, what exactly is it running on when it's on the device?
It's just rendering the actual running on the Flutter view. So I think it's some version of the Flutter/Dart virtual machine that's actually doing the rendering. And that's what I said, you have to look at the talks there to really understand. I don't want to...
Does it get sent with the actual
Yes.
app? So every app has this version, this runtime?
Yes.
How big is that?
I think for a simple Hello World app, let's see.
There's 10 megabytes for that cryptocurrency one, total.
Total. Okay, so
Less than 10 megabytes.
less than 10 megabytes for that cryptocurrency app, which was pretty simple, right? So I think you're looking at you probably had a lot of assets there, maybe, but I think you're looking at somewhere like 4 to 6 megs, right? What's nice is they support all the image formats like WebP, PNG, JPEGs, and so you can just, when I was porting my Android app over to, my release philosophy is this. If you're looking to build a Flutter app and you already have an Android app, don't have an iOS app, build a Flutter app and only launch it on iOS. Use them as guinea pigs, right? Or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And what's nice about it is you can just take your entire assets folder and move it over to a Flutter app, right? WebP or not, just move it all over and Flutter will read it. And so that's a really nice way to really understand what's happening. And then what's the beauty behind that is once your iOS users, after any bugs and stuff, are happy with your app, you can literally just go build APK and then publish that to Android. And then now you're just maintaining one code base. So that's my release philosophy. Yes.
So how about the UI? You mentioned the material and Cupertino.
Yep.
Do you, like your personal apps, like you have only one design and you okay to have material design on iOS, or
so
do
if
you
you,
do if
yeah.
and you have both?
I mean, if you look at the big apps on iOS right now, Evernote and Pocket and New York Times and stuff, they're still using material design, but they're using a very custom version to that company, right? And so you do the same thing here. And Flutter actually does that too. So if you look at the material design guidelines, material design actually adapts to iOS. So the drop shadows, it knows that iOS doesn't like drop shadows. And so when you run a material design app, a Flutter app on iOS, it removes the drop shadow from the top automatically. You don't have to worry about that, right? And so the same cryptocurrency app, I think it has a drop shadow in the header. No, this app doesn't. But if it was just used on a normal action bar, on iOS, it would just look like a UI navigation bar.
So you don't have to say Cupertino action bar.
Unless you want specific Cupertino style buttons, that the only use case there would be the alert dialogues, for example. iOS alert dialogues are this translucent, whereas Material Design are just plain white box. You would have to do an if statement there. Yes.
So how would you handle permissions in Flutter?
Yes. So permissions are handled via the plugins. And so whichever plugin is using a permission, it's its job to handle the permission. And then because Flutter is just a view, Android would take over, and then you would accept it, and then the plugin would take over again, and then your Flutter app would get the response. Yes? There's a question here. Yes?
So I didn't see your life cycle methods. Is it because it is just a view?
No, there's lifecycle. I just didn't get into it. If you go to Flutter for Android, lifecycle. How do I listen to Android activity lifecycles? So inactive, pause, on pause, resume, destroy, it has all that, right? You just have to override it and listen to them.
How does that translate to the iOS lifecycle?
So it's mapped closely. If you look at the app lifecycle documentation, it will explicitly say, for example, inactive on Android. This is currently unused because iOS has this idea of inactive. And then pause, both systems use it. Resume, both systems use it. Suspending, I think that's maybe on destroy, but that's only for Android and not iOS. So there's only 2 of these that one supports and the other doesn't. That's just because the OS doesn't support that.
Okay, so then if you want to write something for iOS and Android using the lifecycles, you would have to basically override all of these.
Yeah, you would override these 4 methods, and it's not really overriding. It's actually one method that the parameter tells you what's happening. And so you would go, if paused or suspending, then do this, right? And that's what you would do.
Okay, and so it would translate to something like the view will render on
Yeah.
iOS,
Yeah.
did render.
Yes.
Okay. And you also mentioned Dart's using the active paradigm.
Flutter is, yes. The
Flutter.
framework, yeah.
And can you show us some of the examples of how the observable pattern is implemented?
That's a good question. And let me see if Pub has any good examples of it right away. So there's an RX. So if you actually go to Pub, you'll find a lot of examples. Just search up reactive or RX and you'll see a lot of examples there, right? Without actually trying to run these examples. But here's one example, I guess. Observable.range, scan. I guess it's kind of clear to your question, but you get a lot more sample code just on GitHub.
I think if Flutter is reactive on its own, like you don't need reactive extension.
Yes.
So it's like reactive because you react to the state changing.
Yeah.
Like React Native. You don't do RX.
Yeah.
It's just reactive.
If you add RX extensions, you get observables and that pattern, those extensions, I guess. But on its own, because you're observing the state and you're setting the state and it's following this loop, that's that reactive nature there. Yes?
So earlier you mentioned that some companies are introducing this stream by stream.
Pardon?
Earlier you mentioned that some companies are
Yes.
introducing the stream by stream. I'm just wondering, so if you have an existing app with 2 code bases, one for iOS, one for Android, how would you go about just building on top of those?
So you would basically, in both of them, you would add your own version of the Flutter view. So Android Flutter view and UI Flutter view, right, in each application. But then both of them are sharing the same code base, which is the Flutter code. And then you would be able to read them in both applications.
So can you, what's in the iOS and Android folders?
Yeah, let me show you. Alright, so in the Android folder, you got your app, Gen, Gradle. It's the typical Android project. You can actually open this in Android Studio, and I don't think it would compile because you still need the, actually it would probably compile because Xcode does. And in iOS, you have the workspace, right? So I can open up runner.workspace, and that's going to open up the Xcode project for that Flutter application where, for example, when you're using GCM, you got to put in the Google Play Services info plist, right? So this is why you would open up this project and stick stuff in. So in your use case, you wouldn't actually, you would repurpose this. You would go into these projects and grab the Flutter view and the library out of there and put it in your existing project and render it that way. There's documentation that's supposed to come out for that in about 3 weeks or a month. That's what I've been told. But there's nothing official on Flutter.io, but I'm sure there's something on GitHub on that. I saw some other questions. Yes.
Yeah, so for this, you showed us a couple of examples, the crypto, shadow, and something else.
Yeah.
Were those listed on the Flutter page or?
Those are on GitHub.
GitHub, so
Yeah. there's a really nice GitHub called Awesome Flutter. There's an awesome for everything. So there's Awesome Flutter. And Awesome Flutter is where I found Crypto Shadow and the other ones. There's actually a good video from Google I.O. Last Google I.O. talking about Flutter. This Google I.O. has 6 talks on Flutter, so which is pretty cool, or 4 talks and 2 workshops. And then if you go down to sample applications, open source apps, there's a bunch here for you to learn from. There's a bunch of chat apps, there's a Twitch client, a social network app, Wikipedia, GitHub client, movies browsing, Heroes of Storm, whatever the hell that is, Crypto Shadow, a live location sharing app built with Firebase, backed by Flutter, all that stuff, and music player. So lots of sample projects there. Yes?
So because this is a Google product, is integration with the Google services, for example, Firebase or FCM, is that, do you need to write a plugin for it? Or is
No, there's already plugins for it. Those were probably the first plugins that came out.
So
right?
it's still a plugin, it's not part of the language.
It's not part of the language, right? I guess because they don't want to say, well, this can be part of the language, but that's not, right? Everything's a plugin. The language is really focused on rendering your components and writing your app and business logic really cleanly. And then anything external you need from third-party libraries, you can just use it as a plugin. I mean, because these plugins are already written, technically you can just consider them to be part of the language because all you do is just import them and just use them, right? You're not really configuring Android or iOS. After, at least for push notifications, you have to put in the certificates, but after that, it's just Flutter. Some here? So someone raised their hand. Why not?
What do you think is the how does iOS Word take Flutter? I'm we Android meetup.
Yeah. All those integrates or
well, how do they iOS devs think about Flutter? Do they think it's a cool thing?
Funny enough, iOS developers are also humans, and they also have the same problems as us, where they also want their application on the other side, right? And many of them don't because they don't have the skills, right? Because admittedly, even though I worked on the iOS team at Kobo for 6 months, after 2 years of Android, I still didn't know enough iOS, aside from simply fixing bugs, to rewrite a whole app in iOS, right? And understanding the nuances of core data and all that stuff. And so they have a similar problem. And I think while I'm speaking from a very, my opinion, I think they will accept it the same way as, hey, I want to build an app for Android, and then I don't want to maintain 2 apps. Flutter's giving me this really nice consistent way, and I can port my code really easily.
But on this scale, it's from Google, so it's kind of like
Google
Android.
I'm sure they all have Gmail accounts. So. I don't know. I think
it's cool.
I'm sure
I
there's
also do iOS. So
yeah. I'm sure that we're gonna find, and I know there's a lot of people who are even Android developers who absolutely hate Flutter, right? And I think this is going off on a rant, but I think that mentality to have where you're not open to other technologies is bad for us as a community, right? I'm open to React Native. I'll do a project in React Native. I don't really care as long as it gets the job done. I like Flutter, so I'm talking about it. But if I start React Native and there's something amazing about it, I talk about React Native too, right? So it doesn't really matter because all these technologies, all they're doing is just helping you become a better developer at the end of the day. So I'm sure there's a lot of iOS developers who will hate it, as well as there's a lot of Android developers. At Google I.O. last year, I met so many Android developers who were like, oh, Flutter is just stupid. They're going to kill it in one day. Kotlin's the future, right? We got to support Kotlin. Down with Flutter. I mean, it's 2 competing things. It doesn't matter, right? So that's my opinion on that.
Is that core runtime that we're talking about, is that closed source?
No, everything's open source.
So the entire
even Dart VM is open source. Everything's open source. So you can go to GitHub, Dartlang, I believe. So this is Dart as a language, so you'll see the VM and everything open source here. There's so many open source stuff here, but I think Flutter, yep. And yeah, just scroll through this, you'll find the VM and everything, right? Somewhere. I can't scroll more. There's a lot of private projects there.
You're bringing service. Is there a build script for Flutter, like kind of like a build.gradle for Flutter?
What do you mean? Bringing what type of service? Oh, like a Flutter plugin.
Yeah, like a plugin.
Yeah, there's a pub. It's called Pub, and then Pub will generate stuff for you, and it would compile it for you.
So Pub will like generate a build.gradle and whatever on iOS.
Build.gradle is already generated, right? So once you modify your code, I mean, if you want to create a plugin, you would do Pub something generate plugin, and it would create a plugin with build.gradle, with Objective-C stuff, all created for you. So you don't really have to mess around with that unless you're adding dependencies inside Gradle.
I'm just wondering, what's in it for Google to develop this? Like, my skepticism is kind of like.
I think there's, well, from a political standpoint, again, these are totally my words. I do not want to get kicked out of Google Developer Experts, but I think that they looked at React Native and they said Facebook's, it's owned by Facebook, and we don't want to probably adopt it. And they probably said, look, this React Native, we can probably do better because we have Dart and we have the engineers behind the V8 backing Dart, so we can probably build a better VM, better runtime. And I think that's where the motivations are. To be honest, Google has so much money that they can throw like 40 engineers somewhere and it wouldn't like hurt anyone's pocket. So I think internally at Google, they're doing all sorts of stuff. I asked once, why Fuchsia, right? I asked someone at Google. And they said, well, and I said, is Fuchsia going to replace Android? And not that this person really knew anything about internally, or he didn't want to tell me, but he said, the thing that keeps Larry up at night is a bunch of guys in a garage somewhere building the next version of Google, right? The next version of Android. So Google's doing a lot of R&D. And some of the stuff that we see just comes out of that R&D where they're like, well, we don't want some random company building the next best cross-platform framework. And then no one uses Android anymore. Everyone forgets about Google Android. They're all talking about, XYZ Flutter. So let's make Flutter. Let's make Fuchsia. And maybe we can replace Android one day. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere, and we just take those parts and put it right back into Flutter or Android itself. But I think it's all just an R&D play that worked out for them, and they said, great, let's make it public.
Do they use it?
Yes. So internally, they're using it. That's where the motivation came from when they started. When I was talking about the story, they really looked at the CRM app that they have internally called Green Tea. That's the code name for it, at least. And that's Google's CRM. So you can imagine how big it is and how powerful and millions of features it needs. And so they didn't want to rebuild the CRM app over and over again, adding new features, new technologies. And so it's all written in Flutter. There's also a bunch of other internal apps that I can't talk about that are being built in Flutter. And then Dart itself, all of Google AdWords runs on Dart, right? So it's a pretty big thing for them. All the Angular components and stuff are all Dart.
It also became a big part of the need for something new because back in 2015 when it first came to first launched essentially, they were trying to find a cross-platform way to do 120 hertz applications jank-free on cross-platform. Okay. So they needed to build something themselves.
Yeah. Any other questions?
How are, I guess, kind of, you can speak to the video playback capabilities on Flutter.
It runs video. I'm happy to say that. We added recently.
But does it run, because video, when you get into the code, actually VP8, VP9?
I think it depends on the OS. Okay. Right? I'm totally unsure about exactly how video playback works, but there was a time where it didn't support video. And I was in on a discussion once, and they talked about maybe poking a Flutter hole and having the actual video rendered, but I don't think they went that route. I think they actually render it now, but they're still using the OS to decode the video, and they're just drawing the frames. And I'm 99% sure that's what's happening. Yes?
About Maps, Google Maps?
Google Maps, and there's a discussion about it. Let's look at it right now. Google Maps. Flutter. there's an issue on it that's been going on for a while, inline map support. So the cool thing about Flutter is that if you have a bug, you can write it on Flutter issues, and they'll almost guarantee respond to it. Now, if they fix it or not depends on if your bug is really a bug or critical or whatever, but they respond to it and acknowledge it. You're never not hurt. And then I'll show you guys another life hack for Flutter. I think it's still in progress, but there's a few people. iOS is not supported by the plugin, and we'll add that in the coming weeks. And this was 16 days ago. So it's happening. Things are moving. Here's a life hack for Flutter, and I've seen this happen with a lot of my friends who've done Flutter development. They go to Stack Overflow and they ask about a Flutter question. Now the Flutter team has someone assigned, and I think they take rotation duties, assigned to Stack Overflow, while they go and answer these questions. And not only do they answer the question, they like do all your work for you. And so, the question was relative layout Flutter. And my friend asked this question, yes. He works at Facebook right now, but this is his personal app, and he said, hey, I'm trying to figure out if there's a relative layout in Flutter. And he says, this is what a relative layout is on Android. Here's my layout on iOS. And so he's following my approach, but doing the other way. He's using Android as guinea pig. So he's built an iOS app, and now he's trying to build a Flutter app for Android. So here's my iOS app. This is a view. This is how it looks. And so someone from the Flutter team goes, Flutter layouts are usually built blah, blah. Then you scroll a bit. You're like, oh, wow, this is a long answer. To answer your specific question, even longer. Here's a code snippet. And he builds the whole thing. And he gives a code snippet. And the thing is, this is common among Stack Overflow for Flutter. And that's because the Flutter development team is very, very helpful and very, very friendly, right? And I know them personally, but even if I didn't know them personally, they're very friendly people. If you go on GitHub issues, you can have a freak out on GitHub issues saying something's not working, but as long as you reasonably explain it, they will really respond to you and actually follow up with you to see if this is solved, right? And so the documentation is great. You're not, I remember the early days of Android, there was like no documentation at all. And so it's not like that. It's really solid documentation. And what's great is, if any of you decide, I'm liking Flutter, I discovered something great. I think, for example, video playback, right? I'm going to write a tutorial on video playback. Not only will they retweet you and stuff, but if your tutorial is solid, you can actually open up a pull request on Flutter and get your tutorial on the website, right, as an official tutorial. Someone did that with JSON recently, where they wrote a really good tutorial on how to do JSON, and then they just opened up a pull request, copied that tutorial over from their blog here, and that's it. And now this is an amazing JSON tutorial on how to do JSON level JSON decoding in Flutter. Right, so lots of good documentation. The team is amazing. There's a question somewhere I saw. No? Any other questions? All right. So with that, what I will say is, here's my email. Here's my Twitter. If you have any questions about Flutter itself, or just mobile itself, or any other life hard-hitting questions, you can always email me, faisalabid@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter. If you like this talk, if you didn't like it, comment, feedback, anything, feel free to reach out to me. And even if you're running into issues with your Flutter app, if I can't solve it, I'll point you to someone. I'll introduce. If you're a big company, representing a big company, wanting to integrate Flutter into your environment, I can get you connected with someone at the Flutter team there to really work with you, and you'll get help right from the source. So, thank you.